is Mathieu Roy. I am Assistant Professor in Psychology at McGill, and I am going to be the host for this 6th event of our mini-science series on the brain. We are located on the downtown campus of McGill's University. We are on the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. McGill has long recognized and honored these nations as the traditional stewards of the land and waters that we work on and meet on to exchange and learn from each other. To introduce our speaker on this evening is the mini-science series organizer, Ingrid Berker.
Tonight's speakers both work on the brain and the question of bilingualism. Debra Titone is a full professor and Canada Research Chair in Language and Multilingualism in the Department of Psychology. She is also an associate member of the School of Communication Sciences and Disorders. Dr. Titone's research program at McGill explores how people read, write, listen, and speak languages, possible advantages of bilingualism, and how the processing of multiple languages is different from monolingualism. Her work has aimed to characterize the diversity of language experiences and how this diversity reflects the human brain's capacity for language. Dr. Titone obtained her PhD in experimental psychology from Binghamton University in 1995. Her postdoctoral fellowships were at Brandeis University and Harvard Medical School. She joined McGill in 2002. Gigi Luk is an associate professor in the Department of Educational and Counselling Psychology at McGill. She leads a research program that examines how diverse language experiences shape development and learning. In addition to investigating the science of bilingualism, Dr. Luk has examined how to harness scientific findings on bilingualism to improve educational experience for children from diverse language backgrounds. Dr. Luk obtained her PhD in cognitive psychology from York University, Canada in 2008. She then completed a postdoctoral fellowship at the Rotman Research Institute at the Baycrest Center before joining the Harvard Graduate School of Education in 2011. She has been at McGill since 2019. They will be examining the question of the brain and bilingualism from two convergent viewpoints. Broadly speaking, they agree that the definition of bilingualism is the learning, using, and living with multiple languages. Specifically, they will examine the extended context of language, that is, how people use language in the real world. They both have used census data and socioecological approaches in their research. Tonight, they hope to tackle the controversial topic of the bilingual advantage.
Okay, thank you so much, Ingrid. We agreed, Gigi and I, that I would go first, and I just want to say it's a pleasure to be presenting at Mini Science, especially with my colleague and friend, Dr. Gigi Luk. So I'm going to start. My talk is going to be a quick overview of some of the work going on in my laboratory at McGill, and I'm going to talk about socioecology, language, and neurocognition. So let me, oops, I have to run it. There we go. There we go. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about multilingualism. So first off, there are approximately 6,900 languages around the world. This is from Ethnologue. You could go to that website. Approximately 389 languages are spoken by at least 1,000 people, and this is 6% of all world languages. And approximately 3,000 languages will go extinct this century. And with that is a loss of culture, knowledge, and way of life of speakers of that language. And of course, there are dialectical differences too. So this picture that I have here is just a map of the Americas. Each dot represents a different kind of language that's being spoken there. Now, as Ingrid just said, I've lived in different places in my life. So I grew up in New York City. I spent my graduate days in upstate New York, and then I did my postdoctoral work in Boston. And certainly multilingualism was happening in all of those places. But as someone who didn't grow up multilingual, it wasn't as in your face as it is in a city like Montreal, right? And in fact, before I lived in Montreal, I didn't really study multilingualism. I studied the psychology of language, but multilingualism wasn't something that was on my radar. But ever since being here since 2002, it's impossible to study language without studying multilingualism. So let's talk a little bit more about Montreal and multilingualism in Montreal. So here's a map of Montreal. Here's our island. What's being represented here are different languages that are being spoken in Montreal. So first, let's talk a little bit about Montreal. It has a population of approximately 1,600,000 or so people. Of course, we're in the nation of Canada, which is officially bilingual at the federal level. We're in the province of Quebec, which is officially monolingual at the provincial level, which emphasizes French. And of course, at the Canadian federal level, both English and French are official languages. Montreal is the second largest French-speaking city in the world. And 56% of the population speak both English and French in Montreal. And so if we go back to the map, you could really see this, right? So each dot on the map represents languages that are being spoken according to the 2016 census. And in fact, actually what's being represented here are the mother tongue of people who live in these different geographic regions. So as you can see, red represents English, blue represents French, and other colors represent other languages. And you could see what we all experience for those of you who live in Montreal, that it's mostly French, but there are certain pockets of the city where English is spoken, but it's not exclusively English, right? It's a mixture. So this is a very interesting state of affairs in Montreal with respect to language. And in fact, it's not just English and French. So here's another zoom in of Census. And what this is showing is the number of languages spoken in homes in different parts of the city. And I'm just going to call your attention to this little box here, because in that box, that represents a neighborhood bordered by Côte des Neiges, Côte St. Catherine, and Avenue Darlington and Avenue Van Horn. For those of you who live here, know this neighborhood, where approximately 47 or 48 unique languages are spoken across homes. So for somebody who's interested in language, Montreal is kind of like living in a city of Olympiads, right? People speak multiple languages here all the time. When I first moved here, I was astonished by the feats of multilingualism that I would see, where people would have conversations where one person spoke in French, another person responded in English, and the whole conversation could carry on that way with every other gradation in between. So now we could compare Montreal. Here it is again, the map of Montreal inset with other Canadian cities. So here's a similar map of census data of Ottawa. And here, this again comports to our impression of, for those of us who have visited Ottawa, that you have a river running through a sea of language, right? So you have all the English-speaking mother tongues on one side of the river, all the French on the Quebec side, but yet there's a smattering of all different kinds of languages. And we could play this game in other Canadian cities. Here's Toronto. Here, there's less blue, there's more red, but now we're getting a smattering of other languages, Chinese, Punjabi. We could go to London, Ontario. There, it seems like it's more red than anything else, but there are other colors there represented on the map. And then we could head all the way west to Vancouver, and you could see here it's highly multilingual, but in a very different way than the kind of multilingualism that you see in Montreal. So clearly what we can conclude from all of this is that multilingualism is heterogeneous. And it's heterogeneous both geographically, and it's also heterogeneous at an individual level. So what I have presented to you here, this is right after COVID lockdown, when my lab was basically functioning remotely, and we would run lab meetings on Zoom, as we're doing right here tonight. And so basically every box in this square, it was a different person in my lab. And I can tell you, I could go through each box and each person in my lab, and every single person has a completely different language, bilingual, multilingualism history. And this history can vary in terms of the number of languages known, the timing of when people learn their languages, whether they learned 2 languages simultaneously or sequentially, whether there's a heritage speaker or reader situation. Some people use their L2 or their L3 in an absolute sense more than others. Some people socially distribute their languages differently across the day, and then there's code switching, immigration status, so on and so forth. So really, when you're talking about multilingualism, differences are the norm, and social context matters. So this is a slide taken from some recent work. Right here pictured is Dr. Margot Tiv, who got her PhD in my lab last year, and she's now a postdoc at the United States Census Bureau. And she and I have a couple of papers also with other people in my lab where we're trying to find ways to kind of theoretically frame the different forces that are operative on language. So we, building on other work and socio-ecological approaches, we wrote about a systems framework of bilingualism. And within this sort of systems framework, you can imagine the individual and the individual cognitive, language, and neural capacities are in the middle. And so everything that cognitive psychologists typically do in terms of what they analyze in the lab tends to happen in this little circle. But what we're trying to formalize here is how this little circle, which represents individuals, is embedded in a hierarchy of other potential forces that come from their social experiences using language. So at the one layer up, you could think about interpersonal experiences, so the person-to-person interactions that people have every day. You could think about the ecological forces, so what's happening in terms of the dynamic in one's broader neighborhood or school or workplace. You could think about language at the societal level. What are the societal values, beliefs, and policies that might be impinging on individuals? And then at the highest level, you could think about the temporal aspects of this, right? And by temporal aspects, it's this idea that all of these forces that are operating on the individual and indeed the individual themselves are changing over time. They could be changing developmentally, as we'll hear more when Gigi Luk speaks. And they can also change historically. If you think about the sociolinguistic history of different geographic regions, such as Montreal. So social context is important, and social experiences are complex and often missing from the study of human behavior and cognition, such as language and bilingualism, are these different social forces. And, you know, there's a good reason why potentially, because there are significant challenges with this. And from our perspective in my lab, the challenges are really focused on this idea of how do you operationalize these complex social forces and how do you quantify them? Because ultimately you want to quantify what's happening in order to be able to statistically link these different forces and how they may impinge on individual behavior. So the different approaches in my lab, we operate with this kind of a framework in mind, but our overarching question is how does social context shape bilingual adults' language behaviors and cognitions? And across different students in my lab, we have many different kinds of studies going on, and we have a range of ongoing approaches. So one wave has to do with neurocognitive studies of reading cognitive control and cognitive control, basically what's happening inside that circle. At the next level, we are looking at how can we go about developing new quantifications of socially relevant individual differences. And this now we're basically leaving this bubble and trying to figure out how to quantify these kinds of forces and how they may impinge on the individual. And we've also been starting to link individual performance to societal factors via language census data. So in addition to these neurocognitive studies, we've also been playing with approaches like network science, which I'm going to tell you a little bit about next. And then, as I mentioned before, linking all of this to census data to try to basically co-register all of these different levels of analysis to try to see what are the forces that are operating on individuals when they behave in the world bilingually or multilingually. So here's one example of some recent work that we've been doing in my lab. And this is work of former postdoc, Dr. Jason Gulliver, who's now a teacher of computer science at Marianopolis here in Montreal. So basically what we did together and with other people in the lab is if you think about the kinds of questionnaires that people are asked on basic language backgrounds, it's typically things like sheer amount of language exposure, so the percentage of second language exposure, the timing of exposure, when did people learn their languages, but less understood is how people distribute the use of their languages over different social contexts. So Jason and I came up with this idea where we tried to apply the formalism of language entropy to try to characterize this and quantify this complex social experience. So entropy is not something that's new. It's a measurement that's been around and used in many different fields. But the basic idea of it is that if things that have low entropy tend to be highly predictable and highly regular. And as entropy increases, things become less predictable and less regular. So we reasoned that this kind of metaphor could be applied to how people use language in different social contexts. And what's really cool about this idea of entropy is that it's highly quantifiable. So there's a mathematical formula that can be applied to questionnaire data that people use when they respond on our language history questionnaires. So using this and using this quantification of language entropy, we asked the question, how do individual differences in language entropy impact things like resting state brain networks? So what the brain, activity of the brain at rest. So here's just a sample study where we computed average language entropy for 27 people based on the social context, the percentage use of different languages across different social contexts, the home, the work, and just ambiently in their social environment. And we assessed resting state networks as a function of language entropy, controlling for the timing of language experience, so age of acquisition, second language age of acquisition. And generally what we found is that people who report higher language entropy tended to have stronger connectivity between brain regions that we know from past work have to do with both cognitive control and language. So for example, when we placed a seed region in the anterior cingulate cortex, which has to do with cognitive control generally, resting state connectivity between this seed region and areas of the brain known to be involved in language switching were related to individual differences in language entropy. Similarly, if we had a seed region in similar regions of the brain that have to do with language switching, connectivity between this region and other regions of the brain having to do with language and semantic processing, meaning processing, also related to language entropy. So since then, other people have replicated this result, and many people in the field now are looking at this concept of language entropy and how this might apply to both language processing and general cognitive function. We did subsequent studies where, in addition to brain activation, we were interested in how it predicted, and along with other indices of bilingual experience, behavioral cognitive control. So we had a large sample of bilinguals from Montreal, and we had data for this large sample for what I will distinguish between proactive control tasks and reactive control tasks. So a proactive control task is kind of like something like, imagine you're going to go to a party and you know everybody at the party only speaks English, but you're bilingual. So that means you have to proactively inhibit your knowledge of French as you enter that door because you know that it's not going to be useful in this particular context. Reactive control is more like what it sounds. You enter a room and you don't know what languages people speak, but you're going to reactively suppress one language or the other. Now, of course, the kinds of tasks that we use were more stripped down than that, but that description kind of captures the general idea. So we examined the degree to which bilingual experience, including entropy, related to these different types of control tasks. And we found an interesting pattern of results across studies. We found that there was a relationship for proactive control tasks. And for those of you in the field, you'll know what that is. And for reactive control tasks, however, there was a slightly different pattern of results where the reactive control tasks that had more language involvement did show a relationship, but the ones that did not show a relationship. And this is among healthy younger adults. Of course, the patterns could change depending on different populations under study. So does bilingual experience make you smarter? Because as Ingrid mentioned at the beginning, this is something that's really controversial and often explored in the field. And the answer to my way of thinking is, well, yes, of course it makes you smarter because any knowledge makes you smarter, but it's complicated, right? And as I tried to convince you at the beginning, not all bilinguals are the same, not all multilinguals are the same. So it may not be really a great scientific question in the long run. Okay, so now we're also looking at other ways of quantifying bilingual experience. And one way we've been doing recently is looking at something known as social network analysis. So this is a kind of thing. Imagine you're the person in red here, and you're asked in a questionnaire, tell me the people that you interact with on a daily basis. And so we can quantify the connections between the ego and then who the people, who is the target person, and then who that person knows. And what's interesting about this is that it builds on a highly extensive literature on graph theory. And so there are many different formalisms that could be, many different quantifications that could be extracted from this kind of data, depending on whether there are clusters of people who know each other or whether some people are off to the side. And for our purposes, what we're really interested in is how this representation differs as a function of the languages that you use when you interact with these different people. So we have other studies, and again, this was with Reactive, where we, and others in my lab, where we tested over 100 bilingual adults in Montreal, and we computed these different types of social network profiles for people, and we extracted quantifications from that. And we used these quantifications to see whether we could predict anything about language ability, language attitudes, and also what is the link to language census, so the neighborhoods in which these people lived. And we're currently doing work where we're trying to validate this language entropy construct that I mentioned to you before by grounding it with these different network measures. So we've done a series of studies where we've examined how interpersonal factors map to ecological factors, so the census data, and we asked the questions, which factors predict global versus specific language behaviors? Again, going back to this framework, we're interested in the individual and how this level, which is represented by the social network measures, and this level, which is represented by the census measures, impact what's happening with the individual. And so we have found some interesting results. So if you look at language use broadly, so the degree to which people converse in English on a daily basis versus converse in French on a daily basis, these are the network measures here, and this is the census measures there. And you could see that as French interpersonal use goes up, the percentage of conversations in English as reported in another questionnaire tends to go down, and the conversations in English tends to go up. Similarly, for people who report their interpersonal interactions mostly in English. What we found to be really interesting here is that not only did this make sense and this predicted what we would think, but that the ecological factors also played a role. So depending on the languages spoken or the diversity of languages spoken in your neighborhood, that also pushed around the degree to which people conversed in English or French in their daily lives. Now, we also posed a similar question looking at more granular aspects of language performance. So to what extent do these different properties predict something about specific aspects, local aspects of language use, such as what cognitive psychologists often care about? And so here we had as our proxy measure vocabulary knowledge in English and in French. And again, these factors did sort of push around at this level, but now the ecological factors did not predict. So this suggested to us very interestingly that different levels of different layers of social context and social embeddedness may have more or less of an effect on the individual depending on what's being probed. In another study, we did a similar thing where we looked at language attitudes. So we had a language attitudes questionnaire, and we were able to reduce basically dimensions of how people responded to questions on this questionnaire in terms of something we referred to as French greater than English solidarity, general English solidarity, whether people endorsed items that were consistent with that they favored minority language protection, and other kinds of factors. And what was interesting here is that the degree to which people engaged in interpersonal interactions with people in French, that predicted French greater than English solidarity in terms of language attitudes, but there were no other relationships. But we did find interestingly that the ecological factor, which represents the diversity of languages spoken in one's neighborhood, predicted the degree to which people endorsed questions that were promoting minority language protection. So there seems to be some interesting things here in terms of how people's language experience at different levels predicts not only their use of language in daily life or their more granular aspects, but also their language attitudes. So we've also used network science approaches beyond social network analysis. You can also use network science to basically catalog all kinds of data. So we've done other kind of work where we're looking at network science approaches to understand the languages that people use in different contexts of social contexts of their life. So work, school, home versus family. And we found that, for example, in work contexts, bilinguals tended to use like one language at a time versus in social contexts, they tended to use multiple languages. We could also flip this around and say, how many contexts do people use when they speak in their non-dominant language versus their dominant language? And people, as you might expect, tend to be more limited in the different contexts that they're going to be using their non-dominant language in compared to their dominant language. And then we can also map the kinds of topics that people talk about when they are talking in their non-dominant versus dominant language using network science approaches such as community detection. So for example, when people are talking in their non-dominant language, they tend to be, there tends to be more clusters of what they talk about. Whereas when people are talking in their dominant language, they tend to talk about all kinds of topics. So there tend to be fewer clusters. So our conclusions thus far are that the social context of multilingualism is important and social experiences are multifaceted. And we and others are starting to develop methods and experimental approaches to map this space. And we're looking for ways to study the impact of experimentally induced language experience, right? Because what I just told you about basically relies on the experiences that the participants who come to our lab walk in the door with. What would be really cool is to manipulate this experimentally so that we can look at causality and directedness of what came first, basically. So this is just some of the work we've been doing in our lab to with this kind of a framework in mind. So stay tuned for new work from our lab. I have many different trainees who are working on different things. Dr. Marco Sinaldi and Michelle Yang are working on formulaic language in multilinguals. Dr. Ann Beatty Martinez is looking at social networks and cognitive aging. Esteban Hernandez Rivera and Carla Taran Murillo are looking at bilingual decision-making and reading, and Pauline Palma and Vegas Hodgins are looking at language learning in special populations. So thank you very much. So I'll stop sharing my screen. Okay, so I guess we'll pass it off to Gigi now, eh?
Yeah, thank you, Debra.
Thank you.
Can you see my screen? Thank you. So Debra has already given an extremely relevant overview of the work, and so it is my turn to share with you what I have been doing in our lab. As Ingrid very nicely pointed out, I have a pretty unique background. I started off training in psychology, and then I get training in neuroscience in my postdoctoral fellowship. And finally, I get my faculty position in education. So some of you may wonder, why do I change from psychology to neuroscience to education? One factor that I have been thinking a lot about is how do we put faces onto the numbers that we analyze as psychologists? And what's better to look at education as a context? And that's my motivation to start looking at some of these knowledge that we accumulate in the science of bilingualism and how do we apply it in another context such as education. Personally, I have lived in the United States and Canada, of course. I was born in Hong Kong, so I speak Cantonese as my first language. Then I moved to Singapore. My parents sent me to a Japanese school, but I don't speak Japanese. So I vividly remember how you want to communicate your ideas, but you don't have the language repertoire resources to do so. And then in my late teen years, I moved to Canada and started using English, of course. And throughout these years, I've also been learning French from a European French teacher all the way to college. And then I moved to the United States, which is very difficult to maintain my multilingual identity. And so it's very English dominant. And moving to Montreal, it's a very eye-opening experience. So let me share with you how far was I before I moved to Montreal. I was in Boston. And, you know, to drive is not even 5 hours from Boston to Montreal. But this is the two landscape, the linguistic landscape, it's very different. Like Debra told you, in Boston, you're probably engaging in more of a proactive interference, a proactive control situation where you know by default, you have to talk in English. Moving to Montreal, if you have some French as a background, then you started to wonder, okay, for the next person coming into my interaction, should I speak English or should I speak French? And so these are two linguistic contexts that actually turns out to be quite different. So when I moved from Toronto to Boston, I immediately know I cannot just move my research in Toronto to Boston because they're very different. And then from Boston to Montreal, again, I have to adapt to the environment in order to do research that is sensitive to the environment that I'm currently in. And my example is just a really tiny difference of a 5-hour drive on this map. I mean, this arrow is actually bigger than it should be to illustrate that around the world, there are different kinds of multilingualism going on, and we cannot ignore the fact that these are very different contexts, and multilingualism is a contextual experience. So in my last few years, I always think about these questions, and when I give talks around the world, I also ask this question, and I got really interesting response. And because I don't see you, I'm just looking at my computer, I am just gonna tell you what my general observation is. So I ask these questions: are you multilingual? Sometimes I say, are you bilingual? If bilingualism is more of a norm in where I give talks. So, and I give people some choices. You can say either you're, yes, I'm multilingual, no, I'm not multilingual, or I'm not sure. When I ask this question in the US, typically we have 20 to 30% of people put up their hand and say that they're multilingual, which is quite consistent with the census data in the US. When I say, and some people may say, no, I'm not. And I usually pick on those people who say, I'm not sure. And because they have been thinking about this and they're not sure because of a number of different reasons. And very often they hit on 3 big topics, which happens to be what we found in research to enrich the characterization of multilingualism. First, how early did you learn your second or subsequent language? How well do you speak your second or subsequent language? And how often do you use it? Sometimes I have people whom I call weekend or vacation bilinguals or multilinguals because they only use it when they visit certain places, or they only use it when they visit family members, particularly their grandparents, when the grandparents typically only speak their home language. So these 3 core factors help us to determine who we are as a multilingual. And like Debra showed you in her research, it's only part of the bigger picture. There are many different puzzle pieces that we also have to think about. And becoming multilingual, as you know, it's multidimensional. It depends on how well, how early, and how often. And there are different paths. In some paths, you may be not needing a lot of effort to learn or acquire another language. And so you learn it through immersion, through development, and through absorbing what's in your environment. In other cases, you may be acquiring or becoming multilingual through classroom resources or in a structured way to learn another language. So all these paths will bring you to multilingualism. So when we think about the term multilingual advantage or bilingual advantage, we want to ask ourselves, who are the bilinguals and who are the multilinguals? I mean, who are the multilinguals and who are the monolinguals? And one thing we know for sure is we are ready to learn languages as human beings, but there's nowhere in our brain that we have a multilingual area because we can't be for sure to predict what language we're going to learn. So To understand how we are ready to learn and acquire multiple languages, it's a question to understand how we are ready to learn languages in general. And multilingualism is just a dimension to look at it. And on the other hand, when we look at multilingualism and learning, we are looking at many different factors, such as what are the language of instructions, how are these additional languages are being taught? Are they being taught like in adult second language learners? They're being taught through literacy based on their first or existing language, or like children, more through spoken language and through immersion. And this is very tied to pedagogy and how languages are being used as a content and also a tool of delivery of instructions. Now, very similar to Debra's system framework of bilingualism, I also want you to take a look at this diagram. If you can only remember one thing from my talk, this is the figure you want to remember. Multilingualism is a lived experience, and it involved a combination of individual differences and interactional differences. And for a human being, for example, a child, the three contexts that are most prominent are family, school, and community. But we have now only focused on measuring the individual differences or the contextual differences. But what is very challenging is to actually look at the interactional relationship. So Debra's work on entropy, it's one way to look at it. And I think we are starting to see more innovative methodology to look at how entropy can inform us about this interactional relationship. And then you may say, okay, but what about younger children? We cannot ask them to do that task and linking telling us who they know. So for younger children, their social experiences are more limited in terms of context. So you may think about family at the micro level or interpersonal level in Debra's model. So this is my former student, Dr. Sarah Serain's work. She's now a postdoctoral fellow at University of Houston at the Children's Learning Institute. So one thing we try to ask is if parents' perceived value of multilingualism and hence more opportunity, more exposure of children using their home language, that might be one way that we look at this interactional relationship. So we took a sample of respondent, about 400 of them from the United States using two panels. One is called MTurk and the other one is called Qualtrics. And we looked at where they're coming from. So this is a map that shows you that we have respondents coming from almost all the states, except for a couple of ones in the Midwest. And we extract what they tell us about themselves, their experiences, particularly their second language speaking experiences and learning experiences. And we also looked at how much they value multilingualism or bilingualism. And in this case, in this graph here, we can see that those who don't speak English as their first language value bilingualism the most. But what's interesting is that those who have never learned a second language at all and speak English as a first language, they are most variable, meaning that they value bilingualism to the most extreme here. And so one thing we're trying to find out is what predicts their behavior, what predicts that whether they value multilingualism more or not. And it turns out it's the census data that signify the respondent's IP address at which they responded to our survey tells us predicted whether they value bilingualism or not. And interestingly, the same result is also found in a group of parents, also from this larger sample, who reported that if they value multilingualism more, they're also more likely to engage their children in activities using a home language. Now, in the United States, it's very often that English is the social language, and then people speak a non-dominant or a home language at home with their children. So it turns out that the more parents value multilingualism, the more likely that they will engage their children in different activities using their non-English language. And you may think this makes sense, of course. But at the same time, these are social behavior that are very difficult to quantify. And in this particular study, we were able to show that. What about education? So using state level and district level education data, we have also looked at how multilingualism are being designated in the education system. And we found that this factor has a strong relationship with socioeconomic status. So in the US education system, you can think of it as whether a child has subsidy for their lunch programs or whether the child's family is receiving social support at the state level. Not only these two factors are highly correlated, but they also contribute to academic performance in state exams, as well as children's special education eligibility. And in terms of academic performance in state exam, for those who are in the process of acquiring English, which is the majority of the schools using as instructional language, they tend to have lower performance. But for the multilingual children who are already established in English entering the school system, they tend to do better. And for special education eligibility, there's a very significant difference for children who have both English as more established and then also speak another language at home, tend to be less likely to be identified for special education eligibility. But of course, all of this could also be related to other factors such as race and other demographic factors such as gender in the school system. But this is another line of research that we could look at these trends using state level data. Now, let's get to the individual differences. So one thing that I'm trying to find out is, what about multilingualism changing the way that we acquire information? So what is in our brain? This is an MRI machine that we could use to look at brain structure and activity. And this is a person's brain. I don't remember whether it's my brain, but you can see that in this image here, we can see a gray matter. We can also see white matter connecting different regions, as well as some black areas, including cerebrospinal fluid. And using this technology, using the MRI, we can look at general anatomical structure. We can look at brain activity, and we can also look at white matter structure. And you have already seen some of the results in Debra's talk, looking at resting state connectivity. Now, I have been trying to find out the relationship between when an adult learn the second most proficient language, taking into account how much they use it, how well, and how early. And the variation in the white matter tracts, particularly the corpus callosum, which connects the left and right hemisphere. In this analysis, we found that the earlier the person acquired the second most proficient language, the higher fractional anisotropy is in between the structure connecting the two hemispheres in corpus callosum. Now, these are adults, so we want to take one step back and look at adolescents. What will they found? And we looked at 21 Spanish-English bilingual adolescents, and we control for as many factors as possible in our model. And we found something very similar, except that the region of interest is now moved more posterior to the back of the brain, but it is still in the corpus callosum. So now we know that multilingualism did shape and change brain structure in one way or the other. Now I want to know, how does it change they learn new information? So we asked the adolescents, and we also asked the adults too, but the adolescents' results are what I'm going to show you here. We asked them to be in the scanner while watching a video and listening to some information about earthquake. And of course, we made sure that they have not learned the information yet. And all of this was in English. meaning that for those who speak English as the first and only language, it's in their only language. But for the English Spanish bilinguals, it would be in their second language. My other former student, Sibila Leon Guerrero, who is now a postdoctoral fellow at UC Irvine, she was interested in the area of the brain that is responsible for syntax. So this is called the Frontal Gyrus. And these two panels here look at the brain regions that show connected functional connectivity with this seat in the inferior frontal gyrus. And I'm going to show you in this video that you can see in the English-speaking adolescents compared to the Spanish-English bilingual adolescents, the number of regions, the extent of the functional network are very different. It seems to be more extensive in the bilingual adolescents. Not only it engages with an area posterior in the brain near the temporal region, but it also engages both hemispheres. Next, we looked at another region that is responsible for language comprehension. And in this area, again, if you look at the comparison, the two groups are very different in the extent of the functional connectivity network that correspond to language understanding. But one thing we found is very particular in another study is that the better you know Spanish, the better you are in English reading. So knowing another language well doesn't necessarily mean that you are doing worse in another language. Now, this is different from what Debra showed you in terms of usage. So because we all have 24 hours in a day, the more you use one language, of course, the less you use in the other language. But in this case, the more these adolescents are in the Spanish syntax, they actually understand English reading better as well. So coming to my conclusion slide, remember this question I asked you, are you multilingual? And we determined that it's how early, how often, and how well. And we looked at the interactive experiences between an individual and his or her environment. And here I also want to raise that there are two factors that we have not studied, yet I think it's very important, which is the identity of the individual and the culture surrounding this individual. Language experience, particularly multilingualism, is dynamic. It doesn't stay as a static experience at one time in your life. It changes and evolves as you explore the world in different ways. So if we want to really understand multilingualism, we have to look at the lived experience and how an individual interacts with the linguist environment. Thank you very much. And this is my team from my former institution and also the current institution. Okay.
Thank you, Gigi, for that talk.
No, thank you. Should we go to our Q&A?
I think so.
Okay. So Debra and I, we put together some questions for each other because our work complements each other in different ways. So I have a question for Debra. I always find it very challenging to understand slangs in my weaker language. So for example, in my French and now sometimes my Chinese, is there a difference when you process pragmatics in a fluent versus a non-fluent language?
This is a great question, Gigi. Thank you for asking it. One of my longstanding research areas has to do with how people represent and process idiomatic expressions, right? So these are expressions like in English, you have like kick the bucket, come up roses, things of this sort, right? So not only are these expressions sort of fun in different languages, but they differ across different languages. And they actually are very challenging for people who are learning a second language. Often we focus on like the sound, like the accents that people use, but these pragmatic aspects of language are especially crucial. So recently, there's been a lot of work going on in my lab. So I mentioned before Dr. Marco Sinaldi, who's a postdoc in my lab, and also Michelle Yang, who will be a new grad student in the fall. And we've been doing some studies trying to get at this idea using eye tracking, using new methods of how people process formulaic language. And in fact, when you get with really nitty-gritty measures of how people, like how people read sentences, how the eyes move across sentences when they're formulaic language or idioms or slang or things of this sort in there, there is in fact a difference. But there are some interesting cross-language effects too. So for example, if people, we just found that if people read sentences that contain idiomatic expressions where there's a translation equivalent in the other language, that benefits how people read the idiomatic expression even in their weaker language. So there's a lot of interesting stuff that's out there. So we'll stay tuned for that.
So I guess watching Netflix in your non-dominant language may help because it's more about exposure, and then you also get the written text to help you out.
Absolutely. So we in my lab subscribe to what's known as a usage-based approach to language, and this is the idea that how we represent language builds up based on how we use it. And watching Netflix is a way to use language, right? And especially if you're watching films in your non-dominant language, not only are you getting like specific elements of language, but you're co-registering that with the particular social, interpersonal context of what's going on. That's how you get all that nuance. And in fact, it takes a long time. It can take a lifetime to build up enough exposure to a language to really get the metaphors and the idioms and the pragmatics of it. So yeah, watching Netflix is great.
Oh, I got a perfect excuse to watch Netflix then.
There you go. So I think I have a question for you, Gigi, which is something that we hear all the time. And actually, when I became a parent, I had this question myself, which is, do you have any recommendations for how parents who intend to raise their children multilingually? I know parents have a lot of nervousness about this, whether it should be one parent, one child, or should they worry about sending their kids to different types of immersive language in language situations in schools. So what are your thoughts on that?
This is a very complicated question, but I'll tell you what I think, both as a scientist and as a parent. I think it's very important for us to remember that language is best acquired when parents show respect to the language that you want your children to learn. So as Debra mentioned, there are different ways to enrich or engage your children into growing up multilingually. Being in Montreal, I think is a natural. You don't even have to do anything in particular in order to have their children being multilingual. And sometimes we also have to think about multilingualism sometimes happens by choice. So if you already speak the dominant language and in your daily life, there's no need for you to acquire another language, but you chose to, that's a different way of becoming multilingual compared to if you immigrate to a new place, then you, by social reasons, by economic reasons, you have to acquire the local language, and that's a different scenario. And so both scenarios, parents from both scenarios want multilingualism. But very interestingly, sometimes I also hear parents, mostly in the US, but not so much in Canada, saying that, oh, it's okay if my child speaks English and don't speak home language. And then we hear other parents saying that, oh, it's important that my child speak in the language in addition to English. So they all come from different perspectives, but they all want multilingualism for their children. And my suggestion, and it's one thing that I have also practiced in trying to raise my child in a multilingual context, is to show respect to the language that you want your children to learn. And when they're younger, it's highly recommended that you learn with them and infuse different activities. And I know during COVID time it's very difficult, but we can find videos for children to show that in different parts of the world, there are other languages that are living among other people. So traveling could be one way, but now there's a lot of really great videos showing how languages are being used and taught in different communities and societies. So that's another way during the pandemic.
That's really important. I definitely agree with you that showing respect to the thing that you want your children to learn, no matter the domain, is super important.
All right. So my next question for you, Deborah, is do multilingual process their second language differently when they hear it versus when they read it? You have already touched upon that when I asked you that Netflix question.
Well, this is an interesting question, and surprisingly, less is known about it than you would think. And one of the reasons why, well, first off, the answer is yes. I would say that they do. Anybody processes language differently when they hear it versus when they read it, because different sensory apparatus are involved, different neural regions that correspond to this are involved. Though centrally, you would hope that the content of what's being either read or heard will eventually sort of meet at the top, so to speak, right? Now, in terms of research that's out there that directly compares the two, there's actually not a whole lot of it, because it tends to be the case that people who study the psychology of language or the neuroscience of language, they tend to specialize. They either study reading or they study spoken language, but they rarely put it together, though some people are doing it. We, in my lab, over the years, we've done studies looking at reading and then looking at listening, and focusing on an aspect called cross-language activation, which is the extent to which when people are reading or listening in one language, do they get automatically affected by the other language? Does the other language intrude? And interestingly, I've never systematically looked at this in a particular study, but across studies, what I've noticed is that cross-language activation tends to be more robust when people read versus when they listen. And it could be the case that what's happening there could be many reasons for it. One is that the spoken signal has so much more information in it than just the words itself, right? There's the prosody, which is the melody of speech. There's the accent. There's how people produce vowels in different languages or consonants in different languages. So there's more information in some ways in the spoken signal than in the written signal. But this is something that's up for grabs in terms of if people are looking for dissertation topics out there.
Definitely. I asked this question because I think that would be an interesting angle for us to look at children versus adult second language learners. There's always this myth that children learn everything easier, have an easier time to acquire a new language, but then adults also have the benefit of, gaining from their literacy skills. So like that could be a legitimate scientific question that has a lot of implication for us.
Absolutely. And the impact of literacy, how when a child learns to read, how that changes how their brain represents language can be substantial, right? Because prior to knowing how to read, children just code sequences of sounds all as one big jumbled mass. But when you learn how to read, now you're learning that this jumbled mass is actually segmented in rigorous ways. So that I find to be a really interesting area of research.
Well, we found our convergence once again.
There we go.
So thank you very much, Debra and Gigi, for these very interesting presentations. This was extremely interesting to me because as many people, I have to speak two languages every day and often struggle with it. So I'll have a lot of questions for you that I will save for later. But now I think it's time to thank you officially with a gift. So those are the gifts from the Red Pat Museum, and they are in French and English. So you're going to receive a postcard from the Red Pat Museum. So it's a stereoscopic postcard. So when you open it up and look through it, you get to see this dinosaur that is located in the museum in 3 dimensions. So the Red Pat Museum is Canada's oldest museum. It is located at McGill. It was opened in 1882, and it used to be open to the public, but unfortunately it is currently temporarily closed. But the science outreach team is still working, and we are sending you some of the museum's publications, which are accessible at the gift shop. So you have access to the museum exhibit through the books. So for instance, here we have all of the minerals that are in the museum's mineral gallery. And the last part of this gift is this face mask from the Faculty of Science outreach team. So we hope that every time that you will see this mask, you will remember giving this mini science presentation during the end of the pandemic. The Red Pad is also running a fundraising campaign, and the outreach team is currently building discovery boxes where instead of the schools coming into the museum, they can send these boxes in the schools, especially in remote and underserved communities. And we would we would really like to have these boxes full of amazing things for the kids, like minerals, fossils, skeletons, bones. So this campaign is running as part of McGill 24 crowdfunding. It ends on May 12th, and all donations are welcome. So thank you, everybody, for joining us today. We'll see you next week, Tuesday, May 10th, for a presentation on the adolescent brain with Dr. Cecilia Flores and Anna Weinberg. So thank you again for coming.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.